we have an economist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He was talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he said something interesting for me. And he said that right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was there to collaborate to collaborate with Gorbachev. United States wanted to help the countries that were part of the Soviet Union to help them economically. And he said something interesting because he said he was there. He suggested many plans for Poland and Russia, and all of his plans that included financial aid from United States were accepted for Poland, but all of them were rejected for Russia. Why it was like this at that moment?
Well, before that, we have to back up just a little bit. Ronald Reagan came into power as the American president on a very strong anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union platform. In fact, he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And he used this platform to justify the rebuilding of the American military, both in terms of conventional power in Europe, but also our strategic nuclear capabilities, and indeed our intermediate range nuclear force, the Pershing II missile, the ground launched cruise missile, et cetera, came into being under Reagan. Reagan's administration was staffed with people who mirrored this approach, a very anti-Soviet approach, anti-communist approach. Even when Ronald Reagan finally had a moment of visionary insight and decided that to save the world, it might be a good idea to get rid of some of the most dangerous nuclear weapons in existence, and worked with Mikhail Gorbachev to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty. They signed it in December of 1987. We're coming up on the 35th anniversary of that this December. His decision to do this was not extremely popular amongst the conservatives. I can say without a shadow of doubt that George Herbert Walker Bush, his vice president, was not happy about this. And many of the people that advised George Herbert Walker Bush were not happy about this. The reason why I bring that up is the implementation of the INF Treaty began in July of 1988. 1 month prior, in June, Ronald Reagan visited Moscow, and he met with some Soviet students at Moscow State University. And he was asked the question, do you still view us as the evil empire? And he said, no, that's the past. I view you as friends. We can be friends. And that's what we should be working for. That's a visionary statement. But it was made by a leader who would be out of office in 6 months. We had elections coming in November of 1988. The same month that Reagan visited Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev convened the 19th All-Party Union Conference. I know that's an eye-rolling Soviet-era type statement, but it was very important. All-Party Union conferences were very rare. The last one that had been convened had been done in 1941, June 1941, right before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The purpose of this conference was to initiate a new revolution, a revolution that replaced communist authority with a new Soviet democracy. He talked, it initiated a process that ultimately resulted in elections for the first time in Soviet history. Elections that were held in March of 1989 for this People's Congress. They were electing, people's deputies. And then the Congress would elect a Supreme Soviet, would be like a Senate, and then president would be appointed. The president turned out to be Gorbachev. And the reason why I bring this up is that Gorbachev initiated this revolution, but he desperately needed a Ronald Reagan type leader who would be his friend, who would work with him, who would help the Soviet Union transition through a very difficult time. But what he got was a cold warrior named George Herbert Walker Bush, who had surrounded himself with cold warrior-like people, James Baker, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, people of this nature, who were not thrilled about helping the Soviet Union. They didn't know what was going on. They were unsure. Was Gorbachev serious about these changes, or was this just another ploy by the Soviets to get the United States to bail them out? So while Gorbachev was begging for continued disarmament, which would free him from the defense industry and the need to continue to produce all of these strategic missiles, if he and the United States could agree on reductions, then he could start the business of converting defense industry. And then he could attract investors who would help underwrite this. But George Herbert Walker Bush didn't give him an arms control treaty until late in the game, July 1991. That's when they signed, actually the last day in July 1991. A little more than 2 weeks later, there was a coup that threw Gorbachev out. There was no economic investment, which meant Gorbachev was left trying to restructure a economic system that could not be restructured. When in 1989, December 89, they transitioned from the old state budgetary methodologies to gosrashot, self-financing. There was no business. Factories like the Vodkinsk machine building plant where I was working suddenly went from having state money to pay the salaries of their employees to having no money. And no money meant no money not just for the salaries, but for everything. Because Vodkinsk was a factory town. The schools were paid by the factory. The stores were stocked by the factory. The roads were maintained by the factory. The housing was maintained. Everything was done by the factory. Now the factories broke. And that was the whole country. The whole country was broke. Gorbachev desperately needed Western investment. And Bush didn't allow the investment to come because he didn't trust them. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, who stepped in? Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had a checkered relationship with the United States. He tried to push his way through and become more important than he was. When he became the president of the Russian Federation, he wanted to get the United States to believe that he was more important than Gorbachev. He had a drinking problem. There were people who were unhappy with that aspect of it. He was an unknown quantity. Many people believed that he was not going to be an effective leader and that he would be pushed aside and the communists would come back. The military would assert its people. There was no trust in Yeltsin. So even when Gorbachev fell, these cold warriors surrounding George Herbert Walker Bush continued to be very skeptical about Russia. And many of them believed rather than helping Russia rebuild, that it was in our best interest to keep Russia down. And these people won out. So no, there would be no investments into Russia. What we were going to do is exploit Russia. We were going to facilitate the economic pillaging of Russia, where we took Russia's resources out, but we didn't allow Russia to grow up, where we empowered the oligarchs to rob Russia blind. See, it was easier to deal with the oligarchs because we understand greedy capitalism. It's one thing to give money to a government you don't understand, Boris Yeltsin and whatever this new Russian government was, to fund a nation we didn't understand. Because, even during Soviet times, the idea of how Russia functioned still escaped many analysts who were supposed to be experts on Russia. We didn't understand it, so we weren't willing to give money to it because we had no idea how that money was going to be spent. And as I said, maybe it was a trick to bring communists back, to empower the military. So we made a decision, deliberate decision, to keep Russia down, and we reflect that. Remember when James Baker gave his promise to Mikhail Gorbachev, not 1 inch eastward about NATO, not 1 inch eastward, a promise. He came back and he told the National Security Council, they gave that promise. They said, not so fast. We actually want to expand NATO because we want to keep Russia down. We want to control Russia. We want to contain Russia. And that's why Jeffrey Sachs' proposals were rejected, because what Jeffrey Sachs claims to be pursuing back then, I can't vouch for him. I don't know personally, but what he's telling you is that he was a proponent of providing economic aid to Russia to fix the Russian economy, that he was told no. And I'm telling you that if that is true, what he's saying there is true, the reason why he was told no is because it was not U.S. policy to fix the Russian economy. It was U.S. policy to destroy Russia. And that's what we were trying to do from day one of the new Russian Federation. We didn't want them to get stronger. We wanted them to get weaker.